Should Christians be invested in good alcohol, not just regular old alcohol? Well, in this interview, I am joined by John Anthony Dunne, who's done a lot of research on wine and alcohol in the Bible. And he talks about all the different ways in which wine was made and how it was consumed, and then how there was even craftsmanship involved in a lot of biblical depictions of alcohol, and particularly wine. It's not just a food group as I usually think of it. It's not just calories that they consume, but there might be more than that going on, and that this affects how we think about communion and community in general. Join me, stay tuned. When you talk about alcohol in the Bible, and clearly when you see it as a fundamentally good force in the Bible, or at least one that they seem to positively portray, what's the initial? Is there actually substantive pushback to that issue, or is it all very thin and veiled and kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of legalistic in the not so helpful way of the word legalistic?
Yeah, well, in my context, so I mean, I grew up in a fundamentalist Baptist school context while going to a Calvary chapel for church. And so the dynamic was such that certainly at the school, alcohol was considered just like completely off limits. My mom used to drink and then kind of gave it up. My dad never really drank, and I talk about that a little bit in my book, especially towards the end of it. But for my mom, it was, I think she was newly Protestant. Same with my dad, newly Protestant. They were kind of nominal Catholics, and I think they weren't super convicted about, this or that on a number of issues, but because of the context in which we were in, it was like, oh, if this is what it means to be a good Christian, then that's what we do. And I think, some of the convictions kind of came later, whether it was alcohol, whether it was other things like Halloween, Goosebumps, Pokemon, you name it, Harry Potter, all these things just kind of just became blacklisted. And I don't know if we really thought about it too much. It was just sort of like, this is just what good Christians do or don't do. And that kind of just became it. I don't really remember a lot of biblical justification. The degree to which there would have been any, it would of course have been sort of taking the warnings about drunkenness and sort of supercharging those to where that is all the Bible has to say about alcohol, which is one strategy for approaching this topic. If you're on the negative side of the permissibility question, that's usually what you do, is you just say there are warnings, but the warnings aren't about the excess. It's about the thing, really. It's about all of it.
The thing itself becomes the danger. Or there's a little bit of polite halakha here, right, where you say like, well, okay, you're not supposed to be drunk, but if you never drink it, I know one way not to get drunk is you never drink the stuff in the first place, right?
Now that would be a great argument if it was laid out that way. It usually isn't, though. It's usually like, wine itself, alcohol itself is the problem. I do talk about that matter as well, the kind of sort of putting a hedge around the law, so to speak, where if you just never drink it, then you're not going to get drunk, which is of course one approach to sort of maintaining that commandment, let's say, to avoid drunkenness, and that's one way to do it. That's not the only way to do it. Moderation is another way to avoid drunkenness.
Yeah, and I think you're hinting at this issue of how do we relativize things going on in Scripture, prescriptive teaching in Scripture, into modern culture. So, even in American culture where you have open access to very cheap alcohol, we have open access to lots of calories, right? So we have things that Israelites just did not have. Open access to as many calories as we can eat very cheaply. In fact, in some ways, the cheapest calories are the worst calories that we sell in the United States. And certainly in the UK, me and my wife always joke that the cheapest food in the grocery stores in the UK is like the worst food for you.
Yeah.
The candy bars, you can get 5 of them for £1 or whatever in a treat pack. So, there's this view that wine and any kind of alcohol in the ancient world would have been part of their calorie consumption, right? So, like the idea of not having it would be like, well, how else are we supposed to eat if this isn't part of our daily caloric intake? And then we have this problem of we have too easy of access to it. So you can imagine someone saying like, yeah, nobody should get drunk in this village because those are our calories and we can't burn through those, right? Like we just can't afford that. But that's not the issue. And then I can imagine the other issue, which is, a lot of majority world countries that I've taught in, and you've taught in lots of places, like the people who are getting drunk are basically the guys who are going out there and working 12-hour hard labor jobs, and then they come home and it's just like relief from aches and pains, and it's a thing you do. And that becomes part of the problem. And so in the American culture, we have this really wonky like setup with alcohol where we can get as much as we want. Most of us don't need it for any kind of self-medication. We're not destitute poverty, as Proverbs 31 says, that it might be good for us for who are perishing. And so then the question is, how do you moderate our view? So in some ways, I'm working towards maybe, do all the issues of moderation, are those actually the teaching on alcohol that Americans or Western people should be focusing on? Or is it the dangers of alcohol itself?
Yeah, there's a lot that that's crossing my mind as you bring.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I laid out 15 problems in one.
No. I like it. I like it because when I think about the issue of like ancient caloric intake, I mean, I do think that that's one of the issues behind like Deuteronomy 21 and the law about the rebellious son. I do think that
I talk about this in my new book.
Oh, good. Good. I do think that that's one of the issues there. One of my friends, Dr. Rebecca Welton, has a kind of different take on this, and it's worth engaging with. In her volume, he is a drunken and a
Right.
No, he is a glutton and a
Glutton and
drunkard.
a drunkard. Yeah.
Yes. It's a great book, and she makes an argument that there's kind of cultic issues that are really at the core there. That it's really kind of this deviant consumption with reference to / in worship of other deities, and that's very interesting. She has a whole host of arguments for that. But I think at the kind of my kind of reading is that it's about resources, and it's about depleting those resources, and I think that's really kind of the fundamental issue. And then when I think about like the promises of abundance in, like, let's say in the Hebrew Bible, where like mountains are going to drip with sweet wine, I think we have to see that abundance from the perspective of scarcity and from the perspective of the kind of precarity of life in an agricultural society. The promise of mountains dripping sweet wine is not just, hey, you're going to have a bunch of alcohol. It's foreign armies aren't going to come in and destroy your vineyards and take all this crop. The weather is going to be conducive to such productivity. You're not going to have, famine and destructive storms or whatever, or plagues of various things. And then also, yes, your caloric intake being provided for. I think there's a lot of stuff that is sort of represented by an image like that for an ancient agricultural society. And then thinking about it from a contemporary perspective, we're not coming at these texts and these promises from the same vantage point. We, as you said, we have way more calories than we need, all these things. The other point I want to say, though, about all of this is I think what happens is in this kind of a conversation, this specific point, what tends to happen is we tend to reduce wine to calories as if the point of wine is it's a necessity, whereas we see plenty of evidence that it's a craft. John 2, you've kept the good stuff until now. There's a sense in which there are better versions of wine. Isaiah 25, this well-aged wine that is promised in the eschaton, at the eschatological banquet. That kind of nuance where there's clearly a sense that there's better wines. It pushes back against this idea that alcohol production was strictly a necessity, strictly for calories, etc. Edward Slingerland, in his book Drunk, he talks about how if this kind of caloric necessity thing was like legitimate, it doesn't explain like why there would be alcohol in China, for example, when you've got like tea drinking, and they're clearly addressing the issue of water through boiling water regularly,
Right.
these kinds of things. So that's the other part of this that I think about, is how we can't just reduce alcohol to this necessity, like, oh, water was terrible, they didn't have much else, so they drank wine because they had to, because it sort of suggests that, like, well, we don't have to, so we can abstain, kind of thing. And I think that just misses the point that there is a craft here, there's an artistry here that we would miss. We don't have to all appreciate that craft and artistry, to be clear, but it's present in the text, and I think that that's something that we can also maintain today.
Yeah, and I really I don't think I appreciated that point until I heard you speak on wine, and I was like, oh yeah, I've completely missed. There's this whole other aspect of what's going on in the scripture. So let's just talk about winemaking, and you have a book it's on alcohol, right? So wine is within
Yes.
the pale of alcohol in the ancient Near East. But how is wine made? How are they, in the Iron Age, how are they getting calories and connoisseurship out of the ground?
Right. Well, just a quick point on the alcohol part of that. My book, which will be out October 7th, it's available for pre-order now, is called The Mountain Shell Drip Sweet Wine, A Biblical Theology of Alcohol. And the reason why I say it's a biblical theology of alcohol is because I don't think that there's strictly grape-based alcohol in the biblical literature. I think there's also grain-based alcohol, or we could call it beer. There's a debate about shekar, and I tackle it in the book, this Hebrew term. If you're a King James reader like I was growing up in that fundamentalist Baptist context, shekar was often translated as strong drink. And that's very misleading for a number of reasons. And I think one of the reasons is it makes us think of like whiskey, which of course is anachronistic. They don't have anything stronger than wine at this point.
They're not running a copper still.
Yeah, the yeast will kind of naturally die out as it's during the fermentation process. There's going to be a sort of cap for certain yeasts, how much they can handle. And
Which
so,
is that about 12% alcohol? Is that
it will depend. It will depend on the yeast.
Okay.
Certain strains can handle a little bit more. In my mind, when we're talking about ancient alcohol, the ceiling has to be somewhere around 15%.
Okay.
In terms of, and not that this is like normative, you're always going to see that or anything like that. I would expect a massive range of variability.
Okay.
Sometimes the fermentation process is going to peter out, these sorts of things. But I just wanted to clarify why I use that colloquial term alcohol, largely because, in America, we use that term as a kind of sort of metonymy for, I guess, any alcoholic beverage. And so that's one reason, and because I want to include beer. And sometimes references to intoxication in the Bible don't specify what the contents were from.
Right.
We can assume wine, but it is an assumption. And so I try to cast the net very widely in that regard. As for production, there's a handful of great books on this topic. Carrie Walsh, and there's other books on the ancient wine presses. Frankel, lots of great material. I have a chapter on this, and I because it's a biblical theology, I try to base it on what is represented in the Bible, as opposed to like fully offering a reconstruction of here's how they did it, but sort of like we actually see glimpses of this and that. Like we see discussions about vineyards, we see the types of equipment that are present, we see the types of infrastructure, we see references to the processes like treading the grapes, or like these different things, references to harvest, references to fermenting vats. different things like that give us, a sense, and other books that are going to, write archaeological, takes on like how they made wine, are going to be much more thorough and comprehensive.
Right.
But we do have, I think, kind of like the layout overview form of all of that kind of sprinkled throughout biblical literature. But yeah, I mean, it's something that is a process. I mean, even planting a vineyard, you got to wait a couple of years before you can even start to make wine and enjoy it.
Right.
It's an investment, and it's literally rooted in the land, and so the dynamics with soil, with creation, with ecology is significant. In kind of contemporary wine discussions, we talk about terroir, this French term, which is almost untranslatable,
Right.
and people kind of debate what it does and doesn't entail, but usually it refers to a kind of complex of microclimate, region, and soil, and irrigation, and all these different factors that lead to the final product, without even really talking about what varietal of grape is it.
Right.
It's really about place, and that's a very interesting thing to consider from a biblical theological standpoint, thinking about like the land promise, and thinking
Right.
about how closely associated it is with viticulture, with the growth of and the production of these grapevines. The story of the spies, and the giant grape cluster and all of that, that speaks to the abundance and the fertility of the land, and how that is not, it's not just here's a place for y'all to stay, but here's a place for y'all to thrive and to experience this abundance. So there is all these different dynamics sort of wrapped up into that.
Yeah, so that brings an interesting point, because the public reading of Scripture this last week, which will be a few weeks ago by the time this goes to air, was on Numbers 13, and we're just doing the Torah portions every week. And so there is this strange, land flowing with milk and honey, which is hotly debated what exactly that phrase means. And
Yep.
everybody who's been in the land for the last, 3,000 years is like, how is this flowing with milk and honey again? Right.
Yeah.
And so even that promise that it is a good land that can be worked, that you can survive and live off of this land. But how do grapes fit into that? I mean, we could just talk about grapes, and then those get obviously made into wine. I wonder if grapes are used for anything else. Are they making jam or jelly?
There's references to raisins, right? So we know that they're. I mean, because basically, if you're growing, or if you've got a lot of vineyards, you got to preserve it somehow. And you've got kind of two main options. You're going to make raisins, or you're going to make wine. Obviously, you can eat the grapes straight up, and we see that, but that's going to be at harvest time,
Right.
And so you've got to preserve it somehow. So you're either making wine or you're making raisins, and the bulk of it's going to be for wine production.
So then how are, I'm thinking we'll have to talk about storage at some point here as well, because that features prominently in taste and flavor, as you've pointed out. But how are they watering that? You got to have enough water. You have to have the right type of land. It seems to me that this was a very delicate process. And like you said, you can't just go in there. Proverbs 31, it says this woman, she plants a vineyard, and I'm like, well, that's not realistic. You can't, as an individual, just go out there and be like, I'm going to plant a vineyard, right? That's a lot of work, even like stonescaping and that kind of thing.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So what all are, if you want to plant a vineyard, what do you do? Step one, step two. And I know you've worked in modern vineyards, so you have a actual palpable access to that. But in Israel, what are you going to have to do?
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like, hills are going to be the kind of ideal place. And of course, when you think about something like hills, you've got, different like sunlight distribution and things like that, right? That's going to be a huge factor, as well as like how water might slope down, these things to consider. But it seems like hills are going to be like, ideal. And that's why I think like references like mountains dripping with sweet wine are what they are, is because it's as if you're imagining these mountains or hills or whatever, sort of terraced with vines, and the production. There's so much production at the point of like trampling that it's as if it's spilling out of the vats down the mountains. Is kind of like the idea of the image,
like a champagne glass
yes.
tower kind of thing.
Yes.
Oh, wow,
and when you look at like Amos 9:11-15, or like Joel 3 or 4, depending on whether it's the Masoretic text, you have this sense, especially in Amos, this sense of like, however it's worded, like the treader will overtake the plowman or something like that. So it's as if the viticultural cycle is like sped up in this extreme way. So it's not just that there's going to be a lot of wine; it's that there's going to be a lot of wine made throughout the year, which is not normal.
Right.
It's once a year, and so that's another fascinating aspect of that particular passage. That's why the book is named after that passage. I've worked on it a lot, and I've worked on it for a long time, and I love that passage so much. So it just felt like I wanted to sort of acknowledge the importance of that passage, and its influence on me and how I think about this topic with the title of the book.
I think it's also a good example of, sorry to interrupt you, is the mountains will drip with sweet wine. It's one of those phrases that, like, for most modern hearers, they're like, ooh, all the dust's going to be in there? Like, is it going to bring, like, dirt down with it? Like, it has no pull for us, in which it would have, and for an ancient, especially as someone who lived in the hill country.
Yeah. It's just spilling over. So so hills would be a really important factor. You mentioned enough rain. It's true, enough rain, but it's also, you don't want too much.
Right.
So there's kind of like there's kind of like a Goldilocks sort of thing. So you don't want the grapes to have so much water content, relative to its sugar content, because then you're gonna get like weaker wine in flavor and in alcoholic potency, which is important for preservation, not just for and aging and these sorts of things. So there's a lot of reasons there, why that matters and why that's important, but it will impact the final product. So it's an interesting kind of Goldilocks thing where yes, you need rain, but you don't want too much, and also like when you get it as well also matters. So the dynamic with Israel, where it's going to be dry in the summer and kind of rainy in the winter months, is a really really good thing for vines in
and these are, from what I remember hearing, is these are ground vines. These are not vines that are stabilized on pegs or anything like that.
So I talk about this in the book. It seems like there's a little bit of diversity. There are laws like don't do it this way, but it does seem like that wasn't always followed, and there are some passages that seem to suggest like that there were different methods being used. For example, if you had it along the ground, that's going to impact like water flow and these sorts of things, especially if it's in a valley and everything's flooding down into it. But the other thing is like animals getting access to it as well. But there are laws like something about like not planting certain trees or in vineyards and things like that.
Right.
And that seems to be important. But then you have other passages where it seems like there were trees in vineyards, and sometimes trees were like used for trellising. You've got a couple of different methods being used, it seems, reflected in biblical literature. Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any way we can know. I mean, I know that we have found grape seeds, and archaeologically, I don't know if anybody's tried to grow these or if that's possible, like the Methuselah tree. Has it been done?
Well, so the coolest thing is there's this guy named Chevy Drury, Dr. Chevy Drury. I believe he's at Ariel. he he's like he's a botanist, and I'm not entirely sure about his like academic background, but I know he's not like a biblical scholar. But what he does is he like forages with a team, and they look for wild grapes, and then they try to, they do some DNA studies, and then they will make some comments about the indigenous nature of some of these, and the antiquity of some of them. And then there are some contemporary wineries who, it's more experimental wineries, who will take on some of these in collaboration with their team, and then make wine with them, which is really cool. And so that's the main thing that I know about. And the reason why this would be significant, just to clarify, is of course because of Islamic takeover in the region. They weren't making wine for centuries, right? And so there was just a complete stop there. And then the wine that was reintroduced, or I should say, the grapevines and all of that, it was through European people who thought, this is a great place for wine. We know that biblically, so let's bring what works for us, in France or whatever, over to Israel. And so the main producers in Israel are producing the kind of like standard European varietals that, when you think of wine, will pop into your head, like Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, things like that. Which of course is great, and it clearly works in Israel. And I think some people want to say, well, the reason why it works is because they're originally from here. But I don't think there's any evidence to back that up. Right. But I really am interested in the work of like Chevy Drury, and that whole cultivation and collaboration with these contemporary wineries.
Are they doing like CRISPR, going in and like saying, hey, edit this strand and see what the grape looks like this way?
I wish I knew more about the specifics. Okay. But I just know about it, and it is super intriguing to me. I've yet to try it, but it's something that I've wanted to look into more.
I should admit, I'm not a wine drinker at all. I don't enjoy it. I'll always try it, but I do remember having some wine on Mount Gerizim for the Passover there, and it was a new winery that I think had just been opened a few years, but I remember it was very, I don't even know what the word would be. I know you're hating every bit of this, but it was no. I would say it was just spicy. It just had so many like flavor profiles going on. Okay. Even I, as a novice wine drinker, was like, oh my goodness, there's a lot going on in this wine. I'd never tasted wine that intense before, I guess I should say.
Well, spicy is a characteristic that I often really, really like. Yes.
It was wild. I was thinking like, oh, this definitely tastes not like any European wine I've ever had. Okay, so I'm imagining tiny little grapes, but I guess you go to the grocery store now, you see these like apple-sized grapes. But I'm imagining small grapes, sometimes trellis, sometimes on the ground. And then I think what always puzzled me in my imagination, and students always asked when I show them pictures of the winemaking production that we know of archaeologically, that there's this kind of like, okay, well, we put them in bottles and seal them. Like what are they doing with this stuff when they get it? And how do they hold it and keep it and ferment it? Because that seems like a sealed production issue, right?
Yeah. So it's the fermentation side of it, at least kind of like the primary phase, it seems like they often did it, and this is from archaeological evidence. I don't think there's lots of descriptive evidence in the Bible about this, but there's going to be vats that everything kind of drains into from wherever any kind of trampling or whatever is going to take place on site. And it seems like they would ferment in a kind of open environment, or at least often did. Like maybe there was a special canopy or something like that, but it seems like they were just like fermenting in the open air. And the cap that's created, I don't know if you've ever like been to a winery or seen kind of like what happens when you've got the grape skins in contact with the wine, the maceration as it's called. Usually there's a cap that kind of creates, and that will actually help like the wine like ferment and keep like oxidization,
Right.
it turning to vinegar from happening. So it sounds kind of wild, especially because you imagine like bugs and whatever else getting into it, and presumably that happens plenty of times. I mean, this is big in like Belgian beer making. This kind of open fermentation. If you've had funky Belgian beers, you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
And so but I don't think that, because of the nature of the cap, I don't think you're going to get like weird, funky stuff from this part of the process too much. But then, what do you do with it after that? And so there's different vessels. The main one being at the amphorae, and these are kind of like classic. You see them all over the place. They have handles, and they kind of have like what's called like a third handle, which is how the bottom kind of creates this like narrow tip, so that you could grab it and a handle kind of thing. And now, basically, in order to like get a good seal on these things, because now that it's wine and you want to like keep it and you want to store it,
They're presumably ladling this stuff into these amphora, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things where it's like, what biblical representation is there for this part of it?
Common wisdom. Whatever works best.
Yeah, and surely an archaeologist would be able to point to the kinds of utensils that may have been used for this. But once it's in the amphorae, they would typically, and this is based upon residue analysis, they would typically use a resin of some kind, pitch, something, to coat the vessel, but specifically to seal the vessel so that it would not turn into vinegar. What that means, though, as a result, is that wine would, especially wine that was aged and stored for a while, it would taste a lot more like tree sap as a result than it would necessarily taste like fruit. And that's probably ubiquitous. So Patrick McGovern, who is an archaeologist and a chemist at the University of Pennsylvania, he's I think the director of the museum there, and then has been a professor there for a while. His residue analysis, it's like, that's just one of the most common things that you find is resin. And so when they see like tartaric acid, like the telltale sign that, yes, wine, this vessel was used for wine, in addition to like the vessel being an obvious vessel that includes wine just based on looking at it, they would find the tartaric acid to confirm it, but then they'd also find evidence of resin. So the ubiquity of resin kind of speaks to the main way to keep it from turning into vinegar, the main way of getting a seal. And then I think what that will mean is that they were probably very used to this kind of resinous flavor. And I don't know if you've ever tried a Greek retsina before.
No, although after hearing you talk about this, I think I wanted to look out for one. So
yeah, well, if you have like a Total Wine or a Bevmo, I don't know what kind of like like shops and things you have around, but if you go to a place like that, you should be able to find a retsina, a Greek retsina. And basically this is, contemporary wine that still uses resin, but in a, accommodated way for the modern palate,
So it still won't be as intense, probably.
Exactly.
As
That's what I would assume. So it's a good it's a good way to like get a sense of like, oh, that thing that I don't normally taste in wine, that would be ubiquitous. Like, okay, like it. And so it's a good way to kind of orient yourself to a distinctive flavor profile of ancient wine. And so,
or you could just pour a little Pine Sol into your bottle of European wine, and if you want the same effect.
If you are somebody who likes IPAs in terms of like beer, it's not like these wines taste like IPAs, but the kind of like piney sort of like flavor profile of like an IPA, you're going to get a little bit of that in these wines, which are typically white wines and these resinous white wines, and that is a kind of fun, at least to try it. It's worth getting. The bottles aren't expensive either, at least the brands I'm thinking of.
Yeah, if you do a Passover or a Seder, try one of these wines. Take it back old school, right? Which brings me to probably the most controversial thing I've ever heard you say, which is you argued quite eloquently.
Oh, right.
That the quote unquote first miracle of Jesus
Yeah.
was probably turning water into white wine.
Yeah.
Which kind of has to do with stored wine versus the white wine. So maybe you could explain. I don't want you to give away everything in this book, but this to me is like, oh, this matters.
Yeah.
It kind of pulls together lots of things you've been saying about craftsmanship and taste and flavor and storage and all those things. So
Totally.
why do you argue white wine as the miracle, not red wine?
Yes. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So the first thing, the master of the banquet, when he tastes the wine, he says, normally you bring out the good stuff, and then once everyone's had their fill, as the English euphemistically is often rendered, but it's once they're drunk, then you bring out the lesser, right? You won't care about the quality of the wine anymore. Your taste buds are shot, like whatever is implied there. And we have other kind of references in antiquity about these types of dining customs of doing this very thing. But he says, but you've kept, the good stuff for now. And yeah, that speaks to, or at least raises a question of well, what did ancient people think was good?
Right.
And when you dig into some of the agricultural writers like Pliny the Elder or Columella or figures like this, they'll often talk about, how some wines are good because you don't get a headache from them, right? Sometimes what makes a wine good is it doesn't harm you as much, and there's different ways of thinking about what makes for good wine. But what's really interesting, the wines that are prized in the Bible, there's provenance associated with it, whether it's like Lebanon in particular. It's one of the only places where provenance is mentioned other than Helbin in Ezekiel 27. And maybe Soric, but that's the choice vine, that may or may not reflect provenance. But you don't really get a lot of specifics in the Bible about what makes something particularly good. There's references to how it's it is good or it is better or whatever, but the idea that knowing specifically what's in view is not terribly obvious. Again, going back to these agricultural writers, when they talk about the best wines in Rome, they'll talk about certain producers, and they talk about place over product a lot. Certain places make really good wine, and there's the kind of the best wine is Falernum, and Pliny has a lot to say about this. And it seems like Falernum was probably a white wine, and there's a handful of places where white wine is really highly prized. A great example, probably my favorite example, is this wine shop in Herculaneum, which was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius along with Pompeii, and very well preserved, although destroyed, but in this amazing level of preservation. There are these wines that are sort of on the storefront, sort of at fresco painting. And you've got 4 different colors of the wines, and the most expensive one is the white one. And so you have these different dynamics. And part of the reason why white wine would be highly prized is because it was harder to make. I mean, it basically involves no maceration, so no skin contact. As a result, probably most white wines were technically orange or amber. But the idea of getting something white would mean no maceration, so no skin contact. You're intentionally doing that. But
wait, how do you get the juice out with no skin contact?
So at whatever point when they're trampling or whatever, they would have there would have been Same situation with the vat, where the wine's going to flow
Right.
into the vat, but they would have just, prevented the skins from going into the
Okay,
vat
so there's
as
a
well.
heavy straining mechanism. Yeah.
Yes, something like that. But the idea is that this is going to be difficult, and it also means that you are removing the source of fermentation from the process, because the skins have yeast on them. So that's another thing that like amps up the difficulty. The yeast could still be in the juice, and whatever vats the juice is being fermented in, oftentimes yeast resides in the places where, like on the equipment at breweries and wineries and all this stuff. It just is, because it's been used there, it's sort of still there. So that probably would ameliorate some of the concern about whether they could continue to produce it. But white wine was highly prized. It was difficult to make, more difficult than other wines, more steps involved, and it's more precarious. So one way to think about that, then, like this reference to good wine, is like, well, we have these references to white wine being highly prized and all this stuff. Could it be that, in making good wine, Jesus made a wine that would have been, well regarded and would have been viewed as maybe even more miraculous? I mean, wine in general is going to be miraculous, but white wine, if it's harder to make, that could speak to the significance of this sign perhaps a little bit more. But the last thing I'll say is that if you read the text closely, it never says anything visual about this miracle. There's no comment about how they noticed, the wine, or they except in tasting. It's in the tasting that this sign is recognized. It's not in anything visual. And what I always find very, very fun is when you look at like children's Bibles, you look at any kind of illustration of this scene, films, Jesus films, it's always red wine. And one of my favorite examples is this Mexican film, Reina de Reinas. It's about the Virgin Mary, and it is such a visual miracle that there's no tasting involved at all. Literally, after they poured the water in, they scoop up and pour it back into the vessel, and it's clearly dark. It's a black and white film. It's clearly dark, so you can see that the miracle has happened. And the master of the banquet, without tasting it, just looks at everybody and says, "You've kept the good wine until now," which is amazing, because it just hammers home the idea that people imagine that this was a miracle that you could see and respect, and you didn't have to taste it to realize that a miracle had taken place. And so that the fact that there's nothing visual about the miracle also leads me to think that the water probably looked like the wine. And so that's the kind of the last point. So when we take all those factors together, I think it's we don't know what Jesus made, but there's good reasons to think that it could have been white wine. And I think that is a fascinating point to make, given that wine connoisseurs today are so big on red wines especially. And it just shows, if this point is at all on the right track, it just shows one additional way in which comparing ancient wine and modern wine, there's a lot of things to consider. There's different palates that we're talking about. There's different processes. There's different products. But then we also, this is I think even more significant, we perceive wine differently. We're talking about the wedding at Cana, and we're talking about how this was a miracle. I think we have to keep in mind that wine in general is miraculous.
Right.
They don't know what's happening, Right? They just know if you break up the grapes, bust them open, it's going to turn into alcohol. I mean, they're not going to articulate it that way, the concept of alcohol, but like they just know that you're going to get some kind of crazy potent drink as a result of this, and so there's a lot of like myths about like how did we get alcohol, where does alcohol come from, in different cultures. And I think it speaks to, again, there's a difference of perception. Wine in general is miraculous, so we're talking about the wedding at Cana being a miraculous wine event, but really the whole Bible is full of miraculous references to wine that I think we have to keep in mind. This is just the most significant wine miracle, but it's all sort of divine activity, if you like.
Finally, I'll put one of my theories to you and see how it rings. You may not like it, so feel free to shoot it down. I think of, there's a little bit of modern Christian antipathy towards the land of Canaan and the land in which God settles these people. But I say, well, look, if you're taking communion every week or every month, whatever your tradition is, like you're not drinking Coca-Cola, and you're not taking beer, although you've included beer as a possible beverage food group in ancient Israel. Like there's some way in which my theory is that wine itself ties you to the land, both in the Passover and also the idea that we are connecting to the events that happened in this actual physical terrain. How does that strike you?
Love it.
Okay. Nothing immediately objectionable about that.
No,
okay.
No notes.
Okay. Excellent. John, the name of the book again, the full title of that book?
The Mountain Shall Drip Sweet Wine, A Biblical Theology of Alcohol, with Zondervan Academic.
Wait, are we the first podcast to get in on this?
The first that I have recorded, yes. I mean, I did do an episode on the Jewish Drinking Show, which is run by Rabbi Dru Kaplan. It's a great podcast. But that was more of a let's talk about the types of wine in the Bible. It was about a chapter in my book, but it wasn't so much about the book per se. So this was
the first one to get the overview here.
Yeah.
And did you have to break his heart on Manischewitz wine? That probably.
We didn't talk about
talk about Manischewitz.
No, I mean he has. I mean his podcast is. I think they have over 170 something episodes now. So.
Oh wow. Yeah, I was just talking to some Israelis earlier this week. We were talking about Israel and wine, and they said, yeah, it used to be just this sweet, low alcohol, horrible wine in Jewish culture. And now, because of Israel, literally the wine they're growing in Israel, it's changed Jewish perception of wine. So, so it's another miracle.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for your wisdom and your guidance on this topic, John.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.